And kind of to begin with in an opening, just kind of give you the purpose, kind of the framework of tonight's meeting, what we're looking for, and how we'll set it up. So our first and foremost is we want to provide you an update on where we are in this reevaluation report. We're about midpoint through, so it's a good time to come back out, show you where we are, and we're also starting to see the alternatives that would likely be carried forward to the TSP, which will be the tentatively selected plan, carry it forward into it. The second thing that we want to do is we need your feedback. So we'll present where we are in the study, the alternatives we looked at, the alternatives we're looking at carrying forward, but we want to get your feedback, and feedback will precede our selection, as this is the selected plans to carry forward. The way that we are hoping to do that is following me, Brad Jawant will come up, he'll give you the presentation that you see behind me to give you an idea where we are, and then we will break out into what I would call an open house forum. In that forum, you'll have the opportunity to talk one-on-one with all our different project development team in the back, as well as if you wanted to provide verbal comments for the record, we have an independent stenographer in the front that you can sit down with. You can provide your comments that'll go on the record. Also, if you wanted to provide comment tonight, you can, instead of the stenographer, you can also use a comment card and just fill that comment card out and give it to any one of us that is a core member, and we'll add that to the record. That's not the only ways to give feedback. We also have I guess you have the option of emailing or snail mailing as comments. The email address as well as the address for mail will be at the back end of the presentation, as well as if you saw the fact sheets on the table, we've included that on there as well. Finally, the postcard that I was saying that you can provide written comments and hand this to us is also pre-postage paid, so you can write your comments there and just drop it in the mail, and we'll get that as well. Before I do turn the floor over to Brad, I just want to view it. He's laughing because I stole half his presentation yesterday. I will not do so today. But before I do, I just want to take just a couple minutes and give a little background on what we're looking at, why we're here. And, you know, as many of you are aware, before the Corps and most federal agencies can do anything, we have to be authorized to do so, and then we have to have the authority to do so. And then following Hurricane Katrina, Congress authorized the Corps to build a system, a hurricane and storm damage risk reduction system, that would defend against a 100-year storm. And that is a storm surge that has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. And that was the authority, and we moved forward with that, that construction of that system. That's the system you have in place today. The operation and maintenance responsibilities for that system, that was held and still is held by the local levee authorities. For the East Bank, that's the Flood Protection Authority East, and they maintain and they work year-round to ensure that that system will perform as designed when it needed. They do an excellent job, and the system is in excellent shape. It also meant that as time went forward, anything that needed to ensure that we maintain the 100-year elevations, that work too would be done by the levee districts using local dollars. Subsequently, after the initial authorization, Congress came back into us, and they said the Corps now has the authority to do that work, levee lifts and that long-term 100-year elevation type work, provided that that work would be economically justified, environmentally compliant, and I guess to say environmentally acceptable and technically feasible. And that that is the purpose of this study. That is so that we can see that if it is in the federal interest to assume some of that responsibility, that financial as well as the work responsibility, and ensuring that this system can last and own or provide that 100-year level of risk reduction. So that's why we're here. That's why we're doing the study. That's what we're looking at is our alternatives, our means. And what I do want to stress is, as we go through, and the purpose of the study and the reason why we have that study is not that there's concerns that the system is falling below 100-year elevations or it's not meeting its design, or certain factors were not considered in the design. Settlement, subsidence, sea level rise, they are included in levee building in Louisiana, especially in coastal Louisiana. They are considered as you look for the long term. You know that these are going to be impact or have an impact on that elevation. And Brad will go into what each is and the impact it can have on a levee system. What this study is to look to see if there is a federal interest in maintaining that 100-year level elevations. Is there a federal interest, and more importantly, federal appropriations, should those go towards that? If we have a positive report, then we, the federal government, can assume some of the financial burden that the levee districts now currently. Another way to say that is federal dollars can go where local dollars will currently have to go. And so that's what we're looking at. In short, the study is who pays. And with that, I will turn it over to Brad. I didn't steal?
Much less than last night.
All right. So without further gilding the lily, I will turn it over to Brad Javon.
Hello, and thank you for coming tonight. I understand some of y'all have been here a little bit longer than we intended to make you wait, so I appreciate that. Again, my name is Bradley Druant. I am the Corps of Engineers Project Manager for the studies for both the Lake Pontchartrain and Vicinity project and for the West Bank and Vicinity project. And before I get started, let me just make sure this is working. Okay. I'm just going to jump right in and tell you all what we're going to talk about tonight. I have a couple of frequently asked questions that Ricky's already mentioned a few of, but I'll go through. Then we'll talk about the core study process, some background on the Lake Pontchartrain and Vicinity project, which is the hurricane protection or risk reduction project on the East Bank. The alternatives that we looked at in the study, what was actually selected as the tentatively selected plan. We also call that the TSP, so I don't get my tongue tied trying to say that all night long. And then we'll talk about the study schedule going forward and the public comment period, which is what the meeting tonight is part of. And then we'll have, as Ricky mentioned, some information posters on the back and tables where you can ask us questions after the presentation. And just to reiterate, you can email us comments, and this will be at the end of the presentation too, so you don't have to write it down right now. And we have a lovely court reporter here available to take your comments at the conclusion of the presentation as well. So I'm going to jump right into it. A lot of questions that we get asked related to the studies. What is the current situation with the storm risk reduction system around New Orleans? And the current condition is we're in great shape. Both of the levee authorities on the East Bank and the West Bank have been proactive performing levee lifts right now. So the system provides the 1% level of risk reduction that it was intended to. And we expect that to continue to be the case going forward. What we're really talking about in the study is looking at a longer term situation, over 50 years. Who is going to end up having to pay for that effort to sustain the 1% level of risk reduction going forward? And the question being asked in the study is there a federal interest in spending federal dollars to pay for part of that requirement, the levee lifts that are going to be needed in the future? Why weren't the levees and flood walls built higher the first time around? And as Ricky mentioned, we're only allowed to do what Congress authorizes us to do. And when they authorized this work after Hurricane Katrina, they only authorized us to build the levees to the design height they needed to be at to provide the 1% level of risk reduction when we built them. So typically when you build a levee, you build it to the height it needs to be at, plus a little bit more, because you don't want it to be deficient as soon as you finish building it. And a levee would need another lift in about 5 to 10 years. It depends on where that particular levee is, how long it may be before a next lift is required. But that's pretty typical. Why didn't we start the study until 2018? Again, it's about authority and appropriations from Congress. We got the authority to do the study in 2014, and we got the money to do the study in 2018. So that's why it started in 2018. Even though that we always knew future lists were going to be necessary. Why is the study important? A lot of people don't necessarily understand why you need to raise levees in the future to provide the same level of risk reduction as you have right now. And we're going to talk a little bit about it later in the presentation, but there's a few natural factors in play whenever you build levees, particularly in southeast Louisiana, that make it necessary to do levee lifts. You have the weight of the levee itself that you've just built causes the ground underneath it to settle, and then you also have things like regional subsidence and sea level rise from ice melt and things like that. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But that's why to keep that same level of risk reduction over time, the levees need to be built higher than they are in the present day. And then when would construction begin? The study itself isn't scheduled to be done until the end of 2021, and then construction would be dependent on Congress giving us the authority and the funding to go ahead with construction. So there's no specific date in the future that any of this work would necessarily begin. So that's just kind of a quick over the world of questions that we get to clear things up. And now I'll just jump into the rest of the slides. Again, why are we here tonight? We're trying to inform you on the work that we've been doing over the last year to come to this point where we've put out a draft report that has the alternatives that we looked at and the tentatively selected plan that we've settled on in the report. And to get your comments, issues, concerns with that report, or the way that we evaluated the alternatives that are in the report, or the tentatively selected plan itself. So the study process that we go through here in the Corps of Engineers has a couple different phases. The first phase is what we just completed in the last year. Last year we met with the public. We got some scoping input from you and your initial comments on the study, and we took that information with the data that was available, developed the alternatives, evaluated them, came up with the tentatively selected plan, and that's where we are tonight. We're in this current stage. We've put out a draft report that has an environmental impact statement in it that tells you what the environmental impact of the alternative that's selected would be. And the idea is to give you enough information for you to give us another round of comment and input. The next step is we'll take all the input that we get from the public meetings tonight or through the comment period that's going to end February 7th. We'll look at it, see if we're still on the right track, and assuming that we are, we'll then move forward with additional design on that tentatively selected plan. We're going to sharpen the pencil, get a little more information on what future designs might actually look like, improve our cost estimates, and then all that information will go into a final report that'll again go out for public review for you to see what we've been doing. And then finally that report would go to Congress for them to take action on authorization and appropriations. So for the last year we've been working with the non-federal sponsor, who is the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. The state and federal resource agencies have also been our partners, as well as we've been working with the Southeast Louisiana Flood Protection Authority East. So there's a lot of players involved, making sure that the local interests are represented in what we're doing in the study. The study area itself, I'm sure most of you here are very familiar with. It's the parishes surrounding the metropolitan New Orleans area. So this is kind of showing you the study area itself. And then the bottom right picture here we have is just the outlines of the levees and flood walls on the east and west bank. And you can see we have the perimeter levees and flood walls, as well as the interior ones along the GIWW and the IH&C, as well as the outfall canals too. Specifically here tonight, we're really talking about the Lake Pontchartrain and Vicinity project, which is the hurricane and storm damage risk reduction project on the east bank. It's made up of approximately 126 miles and levees, 126 miles of levees and flood walls, excuse me. And here in this map, you can see we've got just LPV outlined here. So this is the existing system. Unlike the West Bank, right now none of the Mississippi River levees are actually part of the Lake Pontchartrain and Vicinity project. The river levees are high enough to act as storm surge risk reduction for hurricanes based on the height that they're at right now. In the future, that's going to change, and some of the Mississippi River levees will actually become what we call co-located with the Lake Pontchartrain and Vicinity project. So the hurricane design height for those levees will be higher than the Mississippi River levees are, and so they'll have to be raised to accommodate that. And we'll see the picture of that a little bit later in the presentation. So again, why are we here? Everyone's obviously interested in sustaining the system as it is today, providing that 1% level of risk reduction. That's what Congress has authorized us to investigate and see. As Ricky mentioned, is it economically justified, which means do the economic benefits from preventing damage that occurs during hurricanes outweigh the costs of doing this potential work? Is it technically feasible? Can you actually construct the features that you would need to? And is it environmentally acceptable? Do you not have an outsized impact on the environment? And again, we've always known this would be necessary, but there has not been congressional authorization to do it previously. So talking about some of those environmental factors that make it necessary to do this work, for those that may not be familiar, you have regional subsidence, which if you think about it, that's kind of, the ground is settling on a large scale, the entire metropolitan area. That's caused by things like pumping down drainage canals, which lowers the water table and causes subsidence in the entire area. And then you have compaction and settlement of the levee. So subsidence occurs on the entire area. Compaction and settlement occurs just underneath the levee itself, and that's caused by when you pile all that clay material up on the levee and you add that weight to that definite location, that weight will push out water in the foundation of the levee, it'll push out air voids, and so over time that weight causes just the levee itself to settle. And then the other natural phenomenon with climate change, as you're probably aware, is sea level rise. Polar ice caps are melting, there's more water in the oceans, they're rising. So that's causing the water levels outside of hurricane storm surge to go up. And the combination of compaction and settlement of the levees and regional subsidence are causing the height of the levees to go down over time. So that's why you need to go back and do a future lift to restore a levee just to maintain its existing elevation, but because of sea level rise, over time it actually needs to be built even higher. And I've got a little animation just to illustrate that a little more clearly. So you start out with just the levee itself here, and it undergoes compaction and settlement. So the levee itself is going to be a little bit lower over time. And then you factor in regional subsidence, so that impacts the levee and all the surrounding area of the region. And you can see that goes down a little bit lower there. And then add in sea level rise, the water goes up. And this distance that you have between the top of the levee and the top of the water is much smaller if you haven't raised the levees to keep up with all of those factors. So that's really why it's important that future levee lifts get done. Somebody had also asked me in a previous presentation, why do you not just build the levees as high as they need to be in 20 years all at once up front? And so in addition to not having the authority to do that, it's also not a very efficient way to build levees in South Louisiana. What you have on this slide right here is a picture of two levees. It's actually the same location and two theoretical ways to build a levee at that location to have the height that you need in the future. So the top slide right here is an example of a levee that you could build in lifts over time. So you build it once, then you come back in 10 years and you build it again, come back in 10 years and add a little bit more. So this is kind of the base, and this is what you would come back and add in 10 years to keep up with subsidence, settlement, and sea level rise. And then this kind of blue color at the top is the last lift that you would have to build to say in 30 years be at the height that you need it to be at to continue providing that 1% level of risk reduction. And you can see it stays relatively compact and in the same area over the life of those lifts. So on the bottom what you have is this is what it would take to build a levee all at once to be at the same height in 30 years. And you probably can't read it, but the end height that it says you need to be at for this particular levee in 30 years is, I believe, 16 and a half. So to be at 16 and a half, I think it says 2031 there, to be at 16 and a half in 2031, if you built the levee all at once, you would have to build it to 21 today to be at 16 and a half in 2031. And what you can see here is because you're building it so high and the soil underneath it is weak, you have to build these really big berms on either side of the levee so that the levee doesn't just slide off into the marsh or into the lake, depending on the particular location. And what you can see is the top levee is only about 450 feet wide. This bottom levee is 804 feet wide. So by building it in lifts, you require less borrow material to be brought in, so you're reducing construction traffic impacts. You have to acquire less property, so a lot of levees are pretty close to people's backyards, and nobody wants to lose their backyard. And you also have fewer environmental impacts because you're not impacting as much marsh and that sort of thing. So that's why levees have always been built in lifts traditionally in southeast Louisiana. So I just wanted to explain that really quick for people that might think, oh, well, why don't you just build it all at once? And that seems simpler, but it's really a better way to build a levee. It's more efficient all around. So again, the purpose of the study is to evaluate the performance of the project over a 50-year period of analysis based on the known effects of consolidation, settlement, subsidence, sea level rise, and new data. And that's basically just how you measure elevations. We get better at it over time. And then the problems that we're trying to solve are increased risk due to overtopping of levees during hurricane and storm events, and increased risk to life safety and economic damages. So the objective is to reduce risk to life loss and economic damages due to tropical storms and hurricanes. So the way we went about this and what we've been doing over the last year and a half is, first we looked at what are measures that we could take to sustain the 1% level of risk reduction. What could we do, whether it's raising levees, raising flood walls, building sand dunes, breakwaters, what are all the different possible options that you could take? And then we went to a kind of a screening measure, and we'll show you some of the measures that we looked at in a minute out of the 13. We looked at it and said, okay, which ones actually make sense to do? What is possible to efficiently provide that level of risk reduction that we're looking for? And then we took those measures and we put them into 6 alternatives that were a combination of some of those measures that were realistic alternatives that could potentially continue to provide risk reduction for the local area. And then after we did that, we screened 4 of those alternatives, which I'll also show you in a second, down to 2. And those were the 2 that are in the draft report that came out in December. So measures, what are measures? Measures are things like levee lifts, surge barrier, blocking off water from entering the Lake Pontchartrain at Chef Pass and the Wrigley's Pass, building new flood walls, breakwaters, that sort of thing. Non-structural is improving the area's evacuation plan, working with the EOCs for the various parishes around the city, flood-proofing pump stations, elevating buildings, that sort of stuff. And the nature-based is building marsh, et cetera. So those are the measures that were ultimately combined into some alternatives. And really the only measures that were effective and efficient were things like raising levees and raising the flood walls. So the first alternative that we always have to have is the no action alternative, where we don't do anything, which is what nobody wants, because everybody wants the system to continue to sustain that level of risk reduction that people expect. The first alternative that we looked at was, well, what if all we do is, and I forgot to mention this earlier, so levees are typically built in lifts, flood walls, very hard to come back and raise later. So we built the flood walls with a 50-year projected life to 2057 based on kind of when we started everything in 2007. So the first thing we looked at was, well, what if we just go and we continue to raise the levees to keep up with settlement consolidation and sea level rise through 2057, which is when we expect the flood walls to be good through, because then you avoid the cost of having to either modify or replace flood walls, which is really expensive. The Second alternative we looked at was, okay, well, let's go out, and everybody would love to have hurricane protection even longer. Typically, we analyze projects over a 50-year period. So if we extend that through 2073 and provide that 1% level of risk reduction through 2073, what are the costs and the benefits associated with that? And the main difference between alternative 1 and 2 is, okay, now you're having to replace flood walls and modify flood walls because you've exceeded their expected lifetime. And that's just based on, again, sea level rise. They have a higher design height. They would have too much overtopping after 2057 if you didn't modify or raise them to meet our criteria for 1% risk reduction. The third alternative was, okay, is there something higher than the 1%? Can we go to, instead of a 1% or a 100-year system, could we go to a 200-year system? Could we go to that's the 0.5% probability event? And then the fourth was in there. It's like, is an option, okay, if we can't economically justify raising the whole system, you know, could we identify select reaches that are the most vulnerable that we could raise that are affordable and still get a lot of benefits? Now, the good news is we didn't have to go there. We were able to economically justify raising the entire system. So that was an alternative that was screened out, as well as the non-structural, which would be things like raising structures, that sort of thing. And alternative 6 was a placeholder for the sponsor plan, but we're actually in alignment with the state master plan, so a separate sponsor plan wasn't needed. So the two alternatives that we carried forward into the draft report were really alternatives 2 and 3. We looked at what were the cumulative costs associated with sustaining the 1% level of risk reduction, doing levee lifts, modifying and replacing flood walls to keep them at the design heights that they needed to be at to provide the 1% or 100-year level of risk reduction through 2073. So that was the first final alternative. And then the alternative 3, which was looking at a system that would provide the 200-year 0.5% level of risk reduction, was the second final alternative that we looked at. So alternative 2 is providing the level of risk reduction, the 1% level of risk reduction through 2073 is the tentatively selected plan. And the reason that it is the tentatively selected plan, is that we're required to look at what we call the National Economic Development Plan. It's the alternative that provides the most benefits to the national economy, and that's core policy. So you'll see in a second, I'll give you the prices, you'll be able to tell, but basically to come up with these alternatives and how we compare them, we do hydraulic modeling, we do cost estimates, we look at the benefits, as I stated. We looked at the environmental impacts to see if one alternative has significantly more impacts than the other. And then we take into consideration things like real estate, life safety, and risk reduction to critical infrastructure. So the tentatively selected plan, again, is alternative 2. It's providing or continuing to provide that 1% level of risk reduction through 2073. And it requires raising about 50 miles of levee and 19 miles of flood wall on the east bank of the Mississippi River. The estimated cost is $2.6 billion over 50 years. So that would be cost shared, 65% federal and 35% by the local taxpayers, assuming Congress authorizes and appropriates money to do that. I think that just a couple of key things I wanted to point out, as I mentioned earlier, for the first time on the East Bank, part of the Mississippi River levees here actually become part of the hurricane project and not just the Mississippi River and Tributaries project, which prevents riverine flooding. So these are Mississippi River levees and flood walls that will have to be raised to a higher height to provide damage risk reduction.
It's on the East Bank?
This is on the East Bank, yes, sir. This is all in St. Bernard. So it stops a little bit downriver of the IH&C lock, if you're familiar. So just an idea. And what I'd say to that is really, and we preach on this a lot, and the local officials do too, this is supposed to be a property risk reduction system. We always encourage everyone to evacuate. You know, the city's made a lot of strides in providing evacuation options to folks that may not have vehicles going forward. But really, it's a kind of a last resort considered a life safety protection system. It's really supposed to be, we're trying to reduce risk of economic damage going forward. But if you want specifics on that, we have some people here that could help you. I just can't get into the details. That's not my wheelhouse. So, and if you have questions, I just ask you to ask at the end of the presentation in the back. For the next steps and the path forward, we're going to take your comments tonight through the end of the comment period, February 7th, and we will look at those. Those will go in the final report. So if you do have comments and you want to make sure that they were noted and that other people see them, I encourage you to give them to us. They will go in the final report, so they will be a public record of them. We'll continue to refine the design and put that into the final report that'll come out next year. And basically, after we're done, it goes to Congress, and it's up to them. It's their discretion whether or not they want to authorize and appropriate funds for the work to go forward. So this is not a guarantee by any means, just because it appears that there is an economic justification and it's feasible and environmentally acceptable to do the work. Congress still has that discretionary authority as to whether they will authorize and fund it. Assuming that they do, then we would go into a design phase where we'd come up with more detailed designs, advertise and award construction contracts, and actually begin the work. So we're still several years away, and Congress acting from actually seeing any of this come to fruition. But what I would say is that the benefit to cost ratio for this work is very strong, and so it makes a good case for Congress going forward and funding it. The project should be competitive with other projects around the country when they're making those kind of decisions. So again, the comment period is going to run through February 7th, 2020. You can send me snail mail at this address here. I'm going to leave this slide up so you don't have to rush. This is the last slide tonight. You have the email option below. And again, we also have the court reporter here that can take your official comment, as well as the cards that you can take and then drop in the mail if you don't want to write a letter yourself. And with that, I think, Ricky, did you have anything else to finish up? Okay, and I will obviously be in the back for any questions folks have after the meeting. Thank you for coming tonight. I really appreciate it.
Good job. All right. Yeah. Good job. I do want to thank everybody for coming out. I also want to apologize for the time change. We had 5 o'clock on some things, 6 o'clock on the other. That's entirely my fault. So I do apologize, and I'm so happy you guys stuck around. At this point, we are going to break into what I will call the open house. We have our project development team in the back. We have planners. We have environmental specialists. We have, of course, project management. And so they'll be able to talk with you one-on-one, answer any questions you have about what we're looking at, where we're going through, as well as do want to reiterate, we have comment cards at the table if you wanted to submit a written comment or you want to take one with you that you can mail in to us later. And if you wanted to give any verbal, any oral comments that you want for the record, please do see our stenographer and she can take that down for you. Sure. So this report itself is what we have or where we are in the study is on our website. The website is www.mvn.usace.army.mil. Easiest way to do it is Google Army Corps of Engineers New Orleans. If you go to that site, you'll see a link that's called BBA 18. All the studies are under that page, and you can see the full document and all appendices as to where we are now. So we've uploaded everything as well as tonight's presentation. And it is also on the fact sheet. Thank you, sir. It's on the fact sheet in the beginning. That's at the table. So by all means, definitely do check it out. They're all in PDFs. They're easily downloadable. Again, this is our first step. We're in the midpoint. We'll be coming back out to you guys once we make it further into the study to get your comments once again. But tonight, any feedback you have for us will be greatly appreciated. Again, thank you very much for coming out, and our team is in the back. I'm looking forward to talking with you.